Hello everyone, we are from Group 1 and today we want to talk about the age of reason. The members of our group are Andreas Ivan, Yuliani Ursula Sea, Maureen Clarissa, and Dimitri L Putrì. First, historical background. Age of Reason was an intellectual movement emphasized reason and science. It was centered on the idea that reason is the primary source of authority and legitimacy. This movement advocated such as ideals as liberty, progress, tolerance, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. The middle of 17th century, 1650, often considered as the starting point. French historians usually place the period between 1715 and 1789, from the beginning of the reign of Louis XV until the French Revolution. There's four common ideas in this era. The first one is rationalism. It is the idea that humans are capable of using their faculty of reason to gain knowledge. This was a sharp turn away from the prevailing idea that people needed to rely on church authorities for knowledge. The second one is empirism, that promotes the idea that knowledge comes from experience and observation of the world. And the third one is progressivism, is the belief that through their power of reason and observation, humans can make unlimited linear progress over time. This belief was especially important as a response to carnage and upheaval of English Civil War in the 17th century. And the last one is cosmopolitanism, that reflects the age of reason thinkers' view of themselves as actively engaged citizens of the world as opposed to superficial and close-minded individuals. In all, the age of reason thinkers and for to be ruled by reasons, not prejudice. Some American colonies spread the idea of the Age of Reason through pamphlets, newspaper, and other publications. The wealthy women of Paris also held gatherings in their homes where their friends could hear inspiring music, view art, and listen to the idea and writings from the great thinkers. This era raised the question about the rule of monarch, which made the noble nervous, so they start to create censorship. One of the example was Voltaire. Voltaire showed just how disruptive the Age of Reason writers actually were at this point in time. Voltaire's writings were embraced by the French people dreaming of a better tomorrow, and his writing helped to create the French Revolution, which eventually topped the French monarchy. This means indirectly that what Louis XV feared was true, that Voltaire's writings were disruptive enough to destroy the French monarchy. Second, works and writers. Henry Fielding. Henry Fielding was born on April 22, 1777 at Chapham, Glastonbury, England, and died in October 8, 1754 at Lisbon. He was an English novelist and dramatist. He is the best known of the great English novelists of 18th century. Henry Fielding wrote two parodies of Pamela. The first one was Shamela in 1741, and the second one was Joseph Andrews in 1742. Joseph Andrews has been called the first true English novel in the sense of a probable story dealing with recognizable people. It is a parody of Pamela, but it is also a complete novel in its own right.
Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift was one of the 18th century's great writers. Alert to all manner of phoniness, endowed with remarkable talents for parody, and skeptical of modern trends. Swift was a deadly satirist who exposed the moral failings of his age and presented a formidable critique of Enlightenment thought. Swift was born in Dublin of Anglo-Irish Protestant parents and belonged to Ireland's ascendant class, which ruled over a poor, largely Catholic population. After attending Trinity College, Dublin, Swift entered Sir William Temple's household in England in 1689, serving as his secretary and tutor to Esther Johnson. These two became important figures in Swift's life. Temple, a writer and statesman, became Swift's mentor and Johnson a lifelong friend. His letter to her, written later in life, around 1710, as the Journal to Stella, provide a fascinating look at Swift, the private man in his world. And I'm gonna explain a bit background of him that relate to their literature that I want to analyze in Gulliver's Travels, but relate to his story of life. So, in 1726, Swift published his masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels, divided into 4 parts, each recounting of one Gulliver's viae. The book offers different analytic perspectives on England, history, and humanity. But part 1 is the narrates Gulliver's shipwreck on Lilliput, a land of tiny people that symbolize contemporary England. The Lilliputians' diminutive stature speaks volumes about Swift's assessment of his contemporaries like the English, and they have an inflated sense of themselves, a morally debased political culture, and a limitless lust for power, all of which makes them contemptible and dangerous. And the part 2 that I want to analyze is part 2 examines the past. Here, Gulliver finds himself in Brobdingnag, a land of giants, where he is treated as a pet, something not human. His goal is to convince the king that he is indeed human. After long interviews with Gulliver about European civilization, the king concludes that Gulliver and his ilk are odious vermin. The king bases his judgment on moral grounds. Technologically, Europe surpasses Brobdingnag, which represents an earlier stage in history. But since we fuse human development within a moral framework, Part 2 suggests that Europe is in decline and not progressing as modern thinkers claim. The Brobdingnag's superiority is proven in the scene where Gulliver, like the serpent in Eden, tempts the king with forbidden knowledge. It's like the secret of gunpowder that would make him all powerful. And the king refuses the knowledge, knowing it would only cause woe and death. Okay, so next part is about the analyze. A small analyze about the Gulliver's Travel. So I'm going to divide it into 8 chapters and I'm going to tell you briefly. So in the Gulliver's Travels Part 2 in the Chapter 1, there's a great storm. There's a great storm. Great storm is described. The longboat is sent to fetch water, and the narrator goes with it to discover the country. He is left on shore and seized by one of the natives and carried to the farmer's house. His reception with several accidents that happen there is described, and so are the inhabitants. Under chapter 2, the farmer's daughter is described. The narrator is carried to market town and then the metropolis. The particulars of his journey as given. On the chapter 3, the narrator is sent for by the court. The queen buys him of his master, the farmer, and presents him to the king. He disputes his majesty grants scholars an apartment at court provided for the narrator. He is in high favor with the queen. He stands up for the honor of his own country. He quarrels with the queen's dwarf. Under chapter 4, the country is described. A proposal for correcting modern maps is made. The king's palace and some account of the metropolis is given. The narrator's way of traveling and the Shiv temple is described. Under chapter 5, describes several adventures that happen with the narrator. The execution of a criminal is described. The narrator shows his skill in navigation. On chapter 6, next, several country fancies of the narrator please the king and queen. He shows his skill in music. The king inquires into the state of England, which the narrator narrates to him. Next, chapter 7. The narrator's love of his country is described. He makes a proposal of much advantage to the king, which is rejected. The king great ignorance in politics and the learning of that country very imperfect and convent is written about here. The laws and military affairs and parties in this state are explained. And the last chapter is chapter 8. The king and queen make a progress to the frontiers. The narrator attends them. The manner in which he leaves the country is particularly related, and he returns to England. So that's the brief analyze of the Gulliver Travels that I divided into 8 chapters.
Jane Austen was one of the first few women to gain a living as authors. She was actively writing through 1787 to 1811. Her two best-known books are Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. She grew up in a small country town in a large family whose members shared much of their time and many of their interests and activities. From the earlier age, she inhabited her taste for sharp-eyed observation of the variety of human nature. She wrote novels about ordinary lives in realistic settings. Her characters are usually people from the lower ranks of the upper class.
That's all from our group. If you have any question, please don't be hesitate to ask. And thank you for your attention.